Hello, everyone. This is a recording of a short talk that I gave to the Citizens Climate Lobby of Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh chapter, on fusion energy. So without further ado, let's get into the talk. So this is a little bit of a different talk because these guys are climate change advocates and they don't care so much about the technology. From their perspective, all they care about is when is fusion power going to be on the grid? When are we expected? And I open with this line that we expect net energy from fusion in the Spark device by 2026. There might be some other companies out there that gets there sooner, and there are certainly other pathways to fusion. But from our perspective right now, the team with the most money, the most people, the most momentum, the most effort, and the best technical shot at the moment is the Spark team at Commonwealth Fusion Systems. I'm surprised actually by that statement because I didn't think I'd be saying that in 2023, given the fact that Tokamak Energy was founded earlier. We've got other companies in the game, General Fusion, TAE. But right now, Spark is projected to be operational by 2026. So we're going to have net power by 2026. So for those who don't know anything about fusion, fusion is a brand new energy source, totally new, doesn't exist in the world right now. And it's got a number of characteristics. If you're going to compare it to wind, to solar, to fission, to advanced fission, to geothermal. So first of all, it's large baseload power source, okay? So it's zero carbon baseload power source, and it's the most potent energy source known to mankind. The statistic that people throw around for this is that a gallon of gasoline, if a gallon of fusion fuel is 10 million times more potent than a gallon of gasoline. This is nuclear power, but the other distinction is that fusion does not have meltdowns. There are no meltdowns possible in a fusion reactor, and that is a huge difference from fission, and it drives the environmental, health, safety, and regulatory requirements for a fusion power plant. And we saw that reflected in the April 2023 decision by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to regulate fusion, not like a fission power plant is today, but rather like a particle accelerator or science experiment. That loosens the regulatory burdens that have killed nuclear for almost a generation or two generations. Fusion has fundamentally different safety concerns. There are accident potentials in fusion reactors. So for instance, probably the worst one is during full operation with tritium, the vacuum vessel gets punctured and the tritium escapes into a secondary containment vessel or something. That is not a large-scale accident. It's an expensive accident because it leads to decommissioning and then decontamination and then replacement of superconducting materials. But it's not the kind of accident like a nuclear meltdown would be. Okay, so that's a fundamental difference. And again, this is baseload zero carbon energy source. And so it's a great energy source. And so that's the point that I wanted to get across to these climate change advocates, how important this is for the future of the climate and energy. But I also point out that if we had net power in 2026, that would be essentially the Wright brothers' flight. So the Wright brothers flew in 1907. And then it took about 10 to 15 years to get the first airmail, the first commercial flights, the first military applications of flight. So it's a similar path here. We might get net power in 26, but we wouldn't see commercial reactors until the 2030s or so. That's assuming everything goes right. But we are trying to push this as fast as possible, and any and all public support would be super helpful in getting there. So this has been a long time in coming. Fusion power, you've seen some other talks by me about fusion power, the history of fusion power. Fusion was first detected in 1933 at Cambridge University. Mark Oliphant built a particle accelerator where he accelerated a hydrogen ion to about 600,000 volts. And he slammed it into another ion and got nuclear fusion and detected it with neutrons. The first device to get fusion reactions as a bulk device was in 1951, and that was an atomic bomb. That was the first fusion-fission atomic bomb that was detonated by the United States in the South Pacific. But it's not very, very useful for fusion power. The first fusion power machine that we think of as a modern fusion experiment was in 1957, the end of 1957, when Los Alamos built Scalia 1 and was able to demonstrate fusion in a pinch. It was a theta pinch, current around the outside, magnetic field through the middle, squeezing the conditions for fusion. That kicked off the modern fusion research world that we know today, with tokamaks becoming the dominant machine, but also mirrors being tested, pinches being tested, and a whole variety of other things, including CUS systems and plasma structures, Dynamax and other levitating dipole experiment and other exotic fusion experiments. The first fusion product was a neutron generator made by NSD Gradle, and that was in 2000. There was a guy named John Sved and his wife out in Europe who worked for Daimler Aerospace, and he saw the potential of using fusers, which are really simple garage scale devices you can build in your home or garage to get fusion, and he saw a way to turn that into a neutron generator and then sell the neutron generators. So technically, the first product that used fusion as a commercial entity, as a commercial product, was NSD Gradle in 2000. And then the first fusion chain reactions were at Livermore. So most people have heard of the ignition shot that came out in December, which made international headlines and was a big deal. They had a press conference. The U.S. Secretary of Energy gave a talk. There was a piece on 60 Minutes, and it was in the SNL. It was a big deal. But that was sort of when the public paid attention. The actual fusion event that hinted that we had ignition came in August of 21, where NIF suddenly got this huge output in energy, and that had all the characteristics of an ignited target, where fusion events basically chain themselves together. One fusion event causes another fusion event. But it turned out later that was 70% of on-target energy. So it technically wasn't ignition. And so it took another 18 months until this past December when Livermore was able to pull it off. And that's when the big announcement came on. But the first evidence of chain reactions for fusion was in 2021 at Livermore. And then my next bullet point is I think equally important, but probably not getting nearly enough attention. The first full fusion fission plant license is going to be issued this year to Shine Medical Technologies in Janesville, Wisconsin, by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The NRC has taken more than 10 years to certify a fusion fission facility. It is a travesty how long the regulator has dragged its feet issuing a new license. It is a travesty. If we want to fight climate change, if we want to have any hope of fighting climate change, permitting and licensing for new nuclear power plants, both on the fission and fusion side, has to change. It has to change. The NRC can drag its feet until these companies go completely bankrupt, waiting for them to issue a license, and it's just a shame. I mean, Senate and Congress, there's a bill right now called the Advanced Act in the Senate to basically speed up the process and give the NRC more resources, more people, more funding to try to help them speed up this licensing project. And if we want to have a nuclear renaissance to help fight climate change, we are going to need that bill to support nuclear in this country, including fusion and fission. And then, of course, we have the net power projection by 2026, which hopefully will happen. This image, right, by the way, is the famous image from General Fusion, which became sort of an icon for our industry. General Fusion pioneered the idea of a fusion company. Between them and TAE, they were basically the only two private entities in fusion for a long time. And so this is a famous photo of their staff around their prototype 14 piston device from, I think this was 2014. Okay. So this is where the industry stands today. Right now, we're at $6.1 billion in private funding. That number, $6.1 billion, was just announced by the Fusion Industry Association in their industry report that came out, I think, last week. And they also brought it up at a congressional hearing on fusion, which would have been, I think, last month. That money is spread across 40 plus different startups. It's very hard to keep an accurate picture of the number of startups that are in this game because, first of all, it's always changing. There's some level of churn, and then a number of startups stay quiet. They stay hidden. They stay private. There's a lot of stealth startups. And across 40 companies, you get a lot of variation in technology, variation in culture, variation in organization and staff. And because fusion is still a high risk endeavor, there's going to be a lot of churn. There's going to be a lot of startups that go under simply because they don't have enough people. They don't have the right people. They don't have enough technology. They don't have enough knowledge, or they're poorly funded or poorly organized. The Q record is 33% of net power. So Q is the total amount of power out for power in. And I don't want anyone to get confused about this. We are about a third of the way to net power right now. And that 33% comes from the Joint European Torus. Its final run at the end of 2021, December 30th, 2021, the Joint European Torus produced 59 megajoules of power over 5 seconds. Now, I was on the understanding that JET ran on 100 megawatts of input. So if you do the math, that doesn't come out to 33%. But I'm pulling that number from an article written about JET where the reporter actually went and talked to the JET people. And that's the number that they gave out. So my record right now is at 33% of net power. Some people out in the public might get confused about this because when the ignition shot happened, Livermore made a big hoopla about getting more than power out more than in. And that just isn't true. To clarify, the NIF put in 300 megawatts of power or megajoules of power and got about 3 megajoules of fusion energy produced. And so that's a Q of 1%. That's a Q of 1%. One out of 100 units of energy in, 1 unit of energy out. Okay. Now the amount of energy out was more than the amount of laser energy on the target. Okay. So that's why it was ignition, and that's why they made such a big deal about it. But overall, NIF didn't do nearly as well as the Joint European Torus. Joint European Torus is a tokamak machine that was built by the British in 1981, actually. It's been upgraded a number of times, but it was built in 1981. And so they were decommissioning it, and they knew that they could shut it down, and they could basically push it to its breaking point, because after this last run, the facility was going to get shut down and decommissioned. So in the very last run, it's swan song, basically. They pushed it to 33% of net power. So it does bode well for the tokamak community to see that. We have a tokamak that got a third of the way to net power. That hints very strongly at the possibility that when we turn on these all superconducting tokamaks like Spark and Eater or joint Tokamak Energy's HTS 80 machine, we will see net power for the first time ever in human history. And that's where we sit. Okay, then there's time and temperature records. Of course, it's a time and temperature record. So you could have a long time at a low temperature or a high temperature for a short time. So a good one that has both is the East Tokamak, which ran for 17 minutes and 36 seconds at 126 million degrees Kelvin. That's a big deal. It's a very exciting record. And but there's also records that run longer. So for instance, Tokamak Energy in 2015 ran for 29 hours with a cold plasma. So they proved that they can run superconducting facilities for 29 hours continuously. So that shows that these superconducting magnets, the lifetime runs can be extended further and further. And that's an exciting one. There's also a temperature record that was set by the tram tokamak, and I think it was 522 million degrees Kelvin. So there is a temperature record too. So time, temperature, and then both in combination. On the ICF side, there is a shot record that's held by the Naval Research Laboratory. They did 90,000 shots over 10 hours. So they went bang, 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 bang. That's the kind of thing you need for a fusion power plant if you're going to use NIF scale or NIF-like technology. I will point out, NIF is meant to shoot once per day. It's not designed to shoot at high repetition rates. And it fundamentally really can't do that because NIF uses solid blocks of glass to make its laser beam. The Navy pioneered this excimer laser technology where they make the laser beam in a tube filled with gas. Doing it that way is fundamentally advantageous because the gas does not have any heat. It doesn't hold any heat, so it doesn't get hot. So that allows NRL and the Navy to go bang, 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 and that enables a power plant. So for me, that's just a fundamental divide in the laser fusion world. If I'm looking at laser fusion startups, I would favor excimer lasers over glass-based lasers, even ones with active cooling. Gas systems are better; they just are. And NRL has a pulse power record. It's 11.5 million shots over 30 weeks. I had an earlier statement that it was 13.5 million shots over weeks, and I've gotten corrected on that from NRL. So I actually am trying to figure out that discrepancy. So if somebody out there finds a reference for me, is it 13.5 or 11.5? Please provide it in the comments, and we'll clarify that. Okay, so this was, again, the audience was different than normal technical talks. This was a bunch of climate activists, so they weren't so interested in the technology, again. They wanted to understand fusion as an energy source for climate change and as an economic driver. And the economic impact of fusion power is really immense. I mean, it can't be understated. There's a private company called Precedent Research, and they put out a study that estimated that fusion industry could be worth $472 billion by 2030, which is an incredibly large number. And I think, I don't know if I believe it, to be frank with you. I mean, that's such a huge number that it's just mind-bogglingly gigantic. And the question is, will we get there? And, I doubt we will because market adoption is driven by a lot of factors, including public acceptance and public understanding of a topic, right? Like you can't sell something if the customer doesn't understand what this thing that they're buying is, right? So all the fusion companies right now are first mover businesses. That's a classic business case. A first mover business has to educate their customer base, their investor base, the regulators, and get public acceptance and build a workforce. So 472 billion is a gigantic number, and we're going to be fundamentally limited not by the economic impacts, but all these other factors. And then Bloomberg threw out a number of 40 trillion, which they didn't set a time frame on that. So it could be 40 trillion by 2030, 2040, 2050, 2060. Maybe when we're all said and done, it might be worth 40 trillion. So, but anyway, it's a large market. It's a large, large market. We spend $10 trillion a year on energy in the world. Fusion could own a large chunk of that market because of the characteristics of it. So this is a massive market. It means tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of jobs. It means climate fighting solutions, and it means all kinds of valuable spin-off technologies that would ripple into other industries. So you invent something for fusion power, and then you take it and apply it to medical devices, transportation, public safety, large-scale industrial projects, environmental health, energy storage, energy transport, motors, generators, defense technologies, computer science technologies, information technologies, data centers, consumer and home home goods. There's literally lots and lots and lots of spin-off markets for fusion. The analogy is with the space program, and this is a classic example of research funded by federal dollars ending up supporting a wide variety of American industries. So when Kennedy called for a man on the moon, they put a man on the moon, and then it drove the American economy for at least the next 30 years. NASA documented over 1,800 spin-out products developed from fundamental space research dollars. And so in the space program, we had examples like Tang and calculators, space age and aerospace materials, and other things. So fusion could easily be just like that. And that's one of the reasons why we should support it federally and publicly. So this dovetails well with what Pittsburgh has, because Pittsburgh is a hub for nuclear energy generally. And that's because of fundamental investments made first by Admiral Rickover in the early 1950s and late 1940s with Westinghouse and Westinghouse being in Pittsburgh, General Electric up in Schenectady, New York. Rickover turned to those two companies because of their high quality standards, their infrastructure. They were the best suited at the time to support the Navy's nuclear submarine program. And then that made a long-term federal investment in Pittsburgh, which drove the Pittsburgh economy for decades and decades and decades. So there's a lot of former nuclear engineers kicking around the Pittsburgh area that are ex-Westinghouse or ex-Navy, some of whom have started their own companies. That all that experience would be applicable to a fusion power plant, because fusion is a nuclear power plant. It's going to be licensed, it's going to be regulated, it's going to be safety modeled using a lot of existing nuclear infrastructure, and fusion is going to have to fit into some framework from the NRC, although as I may have mentioned, the NRC has ruled recently that fusion is going to be regulated like a particle accelerator. Okay, so for this climate group in Pittsburgh, what can they do? Well, they can call their congressman. We just got a kick in the teeth recently with our fusion budget for this year. So back in January, a little history, the president called for $1 billion for fusion energy, which would have been immensely helpful and accelerated our field immensely, because right now our budget's sort of been fixed for the last sort of 5 to 10 years. We've been sitting around 750 million. And going back, I think going back to like 2010 timeframe, we were down in the 400 million area. So we don't spend that much money on actual fusion. I read one article that it was 0.008% of GDP is actually spent on fusion energy, which essentially means that we don't fund it, we don't take it seriously, we don't consider it an important issue. We don't see the potential of it at the congressional level, congressional funding. And that's despite the efforts of some pretty valiant people. Stephen Dean at the Fusion Power Associates, who advocates for fusion, has been advocating for years. The Fusion Industry Association, more recently, that has been lobbying Congress to do things in fusion, and some of the House staffers inside, and including some congressmen. There's some great congressmen. Eddie Bernice Johnson is one good one that I'll point to that has done a lot for our field. So the president, there was a White House summit in 2022, and coming out of the White House summit, there were changes at DOE, including Scott Sue being elevated to his senior advisory position at DOE on fusion. Scott he was not head of the Office of Fusion Energy Sciences, but in his role, he sat above him advising the director. So all of that said, President Biden called for $1 billion for fusion energy, bumping up the budget by about $300 million. With that extra $300 million, the Department of Energy was going to set up 4 centers of excellence around the country to produce research, cross-train people, and create bridges between the private and public sectors around modeling blankets, tritium breeding, superconducting magnets, and I think that's all of them. Tritium, blankets, superconducting magnets, modeling. And it would have been immensely helpful, because the Center of Excellence would produce people, which is the biggest problem we have. We don't have enough people. would produce research and work, and it would allow companies user facilities for fusion. There's a lot of things that could be done with that money. And I'll just point to the United Kingdom, UKAEA, has a concrete plan that they're pursuing around fusion. Anyway, President called for it. The House of Representatives convened, and there are members of the Fusion Caucus on the House of Representatives, including notably the Republican Chuck Fleischman, who sits over Oak Ridge. So it's relevant to him because Oak Ridge is in his district, and Oak Ridge benefits immensely from this work. So that's important to him and his constituents, and that's why it's important to him, despite, whether it's a D or R on his name. But there were several members of the House of Representatives Energy and Water Committee, the Appropriations Committee, that rejected the change, and they were members of the House Freedom Caucus. So there you go. And then the Senate didn't do much better. They also wanted to opt for a status quo. So they're just going to keep our budget basically the same and not increase it. So we lost $300 million this year, unless in the next few months, a lot of pressure is put on our politicians to act. We're going to lose that $300 million that the president called for. So I asked people in Pittsburgh to call their respective representatives, and in this case, Guy Richenthaler was the representative from Pennsylvania. He's in, I think, the PA 19. So his district sits below Pittsburgh, sort of in the corner of Pennsylvania. Republican, of course, but there's no reason why he can't be supportive of our cause. It's also good for the defense of the country, and it's good for jobs in the greater Pittsburgh area, in the nuclear sector. There's a lot of really good reasons to support this industry. So I asked these guys to call in. Anyway, thank you so much for your time. I hope this presentation had some value for you. Take care. Bye.